2015 says, assume that the United States economy is operating below full employment. This means that they're operating at a recession. Part B says, assume that the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate to reach full employment. Should the Fed target a higher or lower federal funds rate? So make sure, guys, that when you're writing the answers here, you have the proper subheading. This is from 2015. We're doing question 1, part B. And think to yourself, guys, if we're at a recession and the Fed wants to correct that recession, they need to implement expansionary policy. So you want to think to yourselves, what needs to happen to interest rates in order for expansionary policy to be implemented? And hopefully you can see that it's going to be lowering them, right? So for part 1B, the Fed would want to lower the federal funds rate. Think about that, guys. By lowering the federal funds rate, you're making it less expensive for people and businesses to borrow. They'll borrow more, banks will lend more, and that'll stimulate economic activity and hopefully get us out of that recession. That brings us to part C. Given the Federal Reserve action that we identified in part B, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market. Please underline the graph they tell you to draw. And then it says to show the effect of the nominal interest rate. So they're very kind, guys. They remind you to incorporate the nominal interest rate onto your graph. So make sure you format this properly. We're on part C. And the first step to drawing a graph is to title it. So I'm going to title my graph Money Market. Got my vertical axis and my horizontal axis. Remember, guys, we'll have the nominal interest rate on the vertical. And unfortunately, we can't abbreviate that. And we'll have the quantity of money on the horizontal. So we begin any market graph by drawing our downward sloping demand. So this graph is no different. And make sure you label that D sub M. That represents the demand for money. Okay. Once we have the demand drawn in, next we can draw our vertical money supply. And hopefully you guys can recall this is vertical because the Fed says so. Right? They set the monetary target. They control that value. So where these two lines intersect, we get our initial equilibrium. We can trace over to identify the original interest rate, and we can see that the monetary target is going to be down here at Q sub 1. So with this expansionary policy, the money supply is going to shift to the right. Label that one with the subscript 1, draw an arrow to the right, and label the new supply curve with the subscript 2. And now we can identify the new equilibrium values at R sub 2 and Q sub 2. So if you guys can see that the nominal interest rate did exactly what the Fed wanted to do. It was decreased because of the expansionary policy. Banks had more money to lend, therefore loans were easier to get. The price of borrowing the interest rate has dropped. 2014 says, the Federal Reserve can influence the money supply. Assume that the Federal Reserve targets a lower federal funds rate. First of all, guys, hopefully you make sense of the idea that if they want a lower federal funds rate, that means that they want to stimulate the economy. That means that, in essence, guys, they're implementing expansionary policy. Part 1 says, what open market operation, please underline open market operation, can the Federal Reserve use to achieve the lower target? And hopefully you guys can recall that when dealing with open market operations, we're dealing with the Fed buying and selling bonds. And hopefully you can also recall that the expansionary part of that policy would be buying bonds. So guys, please make sure you format this properly. We're on 2014. We're doing question 2, and we're on part A1 first. And like we just said, guys, for an expansionary policy, the Fed would buy bonds. Next, part 2. Given your answer in part A1, what will happen to the price of government bonds? Now, this is important you understand this, guys, or actually that you're not going to understand it. But there are a few things in this class that I simply don't have time to explain. Explaining this relationship would take me about 30 minutes to do, and it's just not worth the time based on how often it shows up on the test. So this is going to be one of the few things that I ask you guys to memorize. All right, guys, please try to do your best to memorize this following concept, that the price of bonds and interest rates have an inverse relationship. So when interest rates go up in our society, bond prices will go down. And if interest rates were to go down in our society, then bond prices would go up. So since the Fed is targeting a lower federal funds rate, they're targeting a lower interest rate. That means interest rates will drop, and therefore the price of bonds will have to go up. So for part 2, there'd be an increase in the price of bonds. Again, because I've asked you to memorize this basic relationship that the price of bonds and interest rates have an inverse relationship. Since interest rates are going down, the price of bonds must be going up. Okay, next, part B. Using a correct labeled graph of the money market, please underline the graph they tell you to draw. Show the effect of the open market operation from part A1 on the nominal interest rate. So again, guys, they're very kind. They tell you to specifically use the nominal interest rate here. So let's go through, make sure we have it formatted properly. We're doing part B, and we're drawing a graph. So hopefully you guys can recall that the first step when drawing a graph is to title it. The title of our graph is going to be the money market. And we're going to have our vertical and our horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, guys, hopefully you can recall that we have our nominal interest rate. Remember, guys, the money market graph is very much a short-run graph because we're dealing with spending money. In the short run, there's not enough time for inflation to occur, so we don't have to worry about removing the effects of inflation. That's why we can use nominal values here. We're going to have the nominal interest rate. On the vertical axis. We'll have the quantity of money on the horizontal, and now, guys, we can draw our downward sloping demand for money and our vertical supply of money. And remember, the supply curve is vertical because the Federal Reserve says so. Now, where these two lines intersect, right here, we can identify the equilibrium interest rate that will prevail in society along with the monetary target that has been set by the Fed. So now we need to illustrate what buying bonds will do to our money market graph. And hopefully you guys remember that's going to increase the money supply. So you want to shift the supply to the right. Label this with a subscript 1, draw an arrow to the right, and then label the new supply curve with the subscript 2. And guys, where these new lines intersect, we have our new equilibrium point with R sub 2 and Q sub 2. So if you can clearly see that the nominal interest rate has indeed gone down because of the expansionary policy. Part C, let me erase what's on here. Part C says, assume that the Federal Reserve buys bonds from commercial banks. Based on this transaction, will the level of required reserves in commercial banks increase, decrease, or remain the same? And remember, guys, we talked about this earlier in class. When the Fed buys bonds from banks, in essence what's happening, guys, is the bank is selling an asset that they already own. So it's not like when you or I deposit money, right? When you or I deposit money, the bank has to keep a fraction of that as required reserves. But since they're selling an asset they already owned, they don't have to keep any of that money as required reserves. So guys, for part C, required reserves would remain the same. And that brings us to part D. Another monetary policy action involves changing the discount rate. They want us to define the discount rate. Well, hopefully you guys can recall that the discount rate is the interest rate banks are charged when they borrow directly from the Federal Reserve. Okay, and that takes care of 2014. 2012. Number 1 says, assume that the country of Rankin Land is currently in recession. A says, assume that Rankin Land produces only food and clothing. Please underline the two goods that Rankin Land produces. It then says, draw a correctly labeled production possibilities curve for Rankin Land. So please underline the graph they tell you to draw. It says, show a point that could represent the current output combination and label it point A. Right? So we've got a recession, and you want to illustrate that recession on your production possibilities curve and identify that point as point A. So first thing, make sure you format it properly. We're on 2012. and working on question 1, part A. We're drawing a graph, so the first step is to title it, and here the graph we're doing is a production possibilities curve. Next, you can draw your vertical and your horizontal axis. And remember guys, the production possibilities curve is not like your typical market graph. It doesn't have your price on the vertical and quantity on the horizontal. We want to take the two items that are being produced and put them on each axis. So they present food first, so put food on the vertical axis. They present clothing second, so put clothing on the horizontal axis. And hopefully you can recall that the PPC bows out from the origin like so. And now guys, remember there were three types of points we had on our graph. If it was on the line itself, that was basically full employment. We were utilizing our resources as efficiently as possible. If it was outside of the graph, that would be unattainable. We don't have the resources or technology to make that combination. And if it's inside the graph, that would represent an inefficiency point when we're not utilizing all of our resources as efficiently as possible, and that would coincide with a recession. So as long as your point is somewhere inside of that line, you'll be in good shape. Part B says, assume that the Central Bank of Rankin-Land pursues expansionary monetary policy, which should make sense because they're trying to get out of a recession. Part 1 says, identify the open market operation that the central bank would use. So we're now on Part B, Section 1, and hopefully you guys can recall that the open market operation that would stimulate economic activity would be buying bonds. When the Fed buys bonds, they put money back into banks. Banks have more money to lend, and the money supply will go up. Part 2, draw a correctly labeled money market graph. Please underline the graph they tell you to draw, and show the short run effect of the expansionary monetary policy on the nominal interest rate. So again, they're very kind here. They tell you specifically which interest rate they want you to use, so make sure you incorporate that. So we're now on part B2, so make sure we're formatting this properly, and we are again drawing a graph, and they want us to draw the graph of the money market. So title our graph, and then we can draw the framework, our vertical and our horizontal axis. Remember guys, we're going to have the nominal interest rate on the vertical, and do not abbreviate that, and the quantity of money on the horizontal. In any market graph, we have supply and demand. I recommend drawing demand first, so we have our downward sloping demand here, and our vertical money supply. And remember, it's vertical because the Fed says so. They control that number. Where these two lines intersect, we want to identify the original equilibrium values right here at R sub 1 and Q sub 1. So the purpose of this graph is that we want to show what impact the expansionary monetary policy is going to have on the interest rate. So hopefully you can recall that the expansionary policy is going to shift the money supply, and more specifically it's going to shift it right. So label that with a subscript 1, draw an arrow to the right, and label the new supply curve with a subscript 2. And whenever we shift the line, be sure to identify the new equilibrium values. So here is the new interest rate, and here is the new monetary target. So hope you can clearly see, guys, that the nominal interest rate went down because of the expansionary policy. That should make sense. With expansionary policy, they're trying to stimulate economic activity, and lower interest rates would do just that. Number 3, assuming no change to the price level, what happens to the real interest rate as a result of the expansionary monetary policy? And then they want us to explain. Okay. So to explain this one, guys, we're on number 3, or part 3. I'd like to remind you how to find a real interest rate. In order to find the real interest rate, you want to start with the nominal value, right, the one that has not been adjusted. Then you want to subtract from that the inflation rate. And what's left is going to be the real interest rate. So they told us there was no change to the price level, so I'm just going to cross out inflation because I know nothing's going to happen to that. And now I need to think about what happened to the nominal interest rate. And hopefully you guys can recall that with the graph we drew before, we saw that the nominal interest rate went down. So if there's a decrease in the nominal interest rate with no change to inflation, then the real interest rate has to decrease as well in order for these parts of the equation to balance out, right? So there would be a decrease in the real interest rate because of the decrease in the nominal interest rate with no change to inflation. And that takes care of part 3. Now I'm going to erase this to get more room. Part 4 says, given your answer to part B3 regarding the real interest rate, remember guys, the real interest rate, like we said before, is going to decrease. What happens to the real gross domestic product in the short run? And then they want us to explain. So for part 4, hope you guys can recall, with this expansionary policy, with the decrease in the interest rate, that's going to stimulate production. That's going to increase the real GDP. Now that part should be easy. What may be trickier is making sure you get everything in the explanation. So please follow along. There's going to be an increase in the real GDP because of the increase in aggregate demand brought forth by the increase in investment spending. Right? So hopefully you guys can see that there is a decrease in the real interest rate, right? And businesses are very sensitive to interest rate changes. So with the decrease in the real interest rate, that's going to stimulate investment spending. That stimulates aggregate demand. It shifts aggregate demand to the right, which in turn leads to an increase in real GDP. So that takes care of 2012. Okay, 2012, number 2 now. It says the following is a simplified balance sheet for Mi Tierra Bank in the United States. Guys, remember when they say balance sheet, that's also another way of saying the T account that we saw in class. Part A asks, what is the reserve requirement? So when trying to identify what the reserve requirement is, 2 things you need to look at. Number 1, how much money is deposited into the bank? And as you can see, it's $100,000 of deposits. And then how much of those deposits are kept as required reserves? And hopefully you can see that there's $10,000 of required reserves. So hopefully you guys can clearly see that $10,000 is 10% of the $100,000 deposited. So for 2012, question 2, part A, the required reserve ratio is 10%. Next, part B says, assume that Lewis withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account at Mi Tierra Bank. So he withdrew $5,000 cash, and that cash was in his checking account. Part 1 says, by how much will Mi Tierra Bank's reserves change based on Lewis's withdrawal? So notice guys, it doesn't say required reserves, it doesn't say excess reserves, it says reserves. So they're talking about the total reserves, the total amount of cash that this bank has on hand. Now, before this transaction happened, I hope you can see that they had required reserves of $10,000 in the vault and excess reserves of $5,000 in the vault, right? So the total reserves here were equal to $15,000. In other words, guys, there was $15,000 worth of cash in this vault. But now he withdraws $5,000 of that out, so now there's $10,000 of reserves left in the vault. So hopefully you can see that the total reserves then decreased by $5,000, right? This is a simple one, don't overthink it. So for section B1, the amount of reserves would decrease by $5,000. Next, part 2 says, what is the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure of the money supply? And then they want us to explain. Now, when I try to explain this question, I try to ask you to visualize the M1 measure of the money supply as being a briefcase. A briefcase with 2 pockets in it, right? So here's my briefcase, and that represents the M1. One pocket in this briefcase represents the cash, while the other pocket in this briefcase represents the checkable deposits. So before this transaction took place, that $5,000 was in this guy's checking account. It was already part of the M1. And now, when Lewis withdraws that money out, and now he's holding it as cash, notice that $5,000, it's still in the M1, it's just in a different pocket of the M1. It's just being held as cash. So hopefully you can see, guys, that for part B2, there will be no change to the M1 because both cash and checkable deposits are part of the M1. Right, so I know that that may be a little bit tricky to understand at first, but hopefully when you visualize that briefcase, the M1 money supply has two pockets in it, cash and checkable deposits. You're just taking that $5,000 out of one pocket of the M1 and putting it into a different pocket of the M1. It is still in the M1. Good, that brings us to part 3. As a result of the withdrawal, what is the new value of excess reserves on the balance sheet of Mitiera Bank based on the reserve requirement that we found in part A? So let's remind ourselves, guys, that reserve requirement was 10%, and this is the one that students usually get wrong, so please make sure you're paying close attention here. The common mistake that students make here, guys, is they say that excess reserves will go down to 0 because there were $5,000 of excess reserves. He withdrew $5,000 out, so doesn't that mean that there's 0 excess reserves now? And the answer to that is no. And let me try to explain why that is. Okay. Remember, guys, there were $100,000 of deposits in this bank. But when Lewis withdraws $5,000 out, now there's only going to be $95,000 of deposits left in this bank. So, based on the 10% reserve requirements, the required reserves have gone down to only $9,500. So, think back to what we talked about before, right? Before we discussed how total reserves, the total amount of cash in this vault, was $15,000, right? Originally 10 of which were required reserves and 5 of which were excess reserves. So there were $15,000 cash in this vault before the transaction, right? Then Lewis withdraws $5,000 of those dollars out of the vault, leaving $10,000 left in the vault, $9,500 of which are required reserves, $500 of which are now excess reserves. So for part 3, excess reserves would be $500. You don't need to show any math, none of that, just $500. And finally, guys, that brings us to part C. Assume that the next day, John withdraws from Mitiera Bank an amount that exceeds the bank's excess reserves. Assuming that they can't call in any loans, how can Mitiera Bank cover its required reserves, right? So this bank is in a pickle. It's running low on cash. It doesn't have enough cash to meet its required reserves. So hopefully you guys can recall that there are 2 options this bank has, right? They can either borrow from the Federal Reserve or they can borrow from another bank to fill their required reserves. And that takes care of the 2012. Okay, 2011, number 1. It says, assume that the United States economy is currently in a recession and a short-run equilibrium. Assume that the Federal Reserve uses monetary policy to stimulate the economy. So hopefully you guys can see that that's going to be expansionary policy. Number 1 asks, what open market policy should the Fed implement in order to expand economic activity? And guys, we've done questions like this quite a few times now. Hope you can see for question 1, part D, section 1, the open market policy, you guys, would be to buy bonds. When the Fed buys bonds, that puts money back into banks, and that helps stimulate economic activity. 2, using a correctly labeled graph of the money market, show how the policy we just identified would affect the nominal interest rate. So let's do it. We're now on part 2. We are drawing a graph, so the first step is to title it. We're going to title this the money market. Right, remember guys, we have the nominal interest rate on the vertical axis and the quantity of money on the horizontal. You want to begin by drawing your downward sloping demand for money and then your vertical supply. It's vertical because the Fed says so. They control that. So now where those 2 lines intersect, we can identify the original interest rate at R sub 1 and the original monetary target at Q sub 1. So now, hopefully you guys can recall that the expansionary policy that we see here is going to increase the money supply. We're going to shift the money supply to the right. So label that with a subscript 1, draw an arrow to the right, draw on your new supply curve with a subscript 2, and then please be sure to identify the new equilibrium values at R sub 2 and Q sub 2. So you can clearly see, guys, that as a result of this expansionary policy, the nominal interest rate went down, which should make sense, because with expansionary policy, there's an increase in the money supply. banks have more money to lend, it becomes easier to get a loan, and interest rates drop. The price of borrowing drops. Number 3, what will be the impact of this policy on the price level? And then they want us to explain. So here, guys, you have to recall the link between the money market graph and the aggregate model, because the aggregate model has the price level on the vertical axis. So as a result of this expansionary policy, guys, we had a decrease in interest rates. That decrease in interest rate is going to stimulate the economy. It's going to stimulate spending because it's now less expensive to borrow, right? So the increase in aggregate demand that we talk about there is going to drive up the price level. There'll be an increase in the price level. And please make sure you get all this in your explanation. An increase in the price level because of the increase in aggregate demand brought forth by the decrease, brought forth by the increase in investment spending, aka business spending, which was brought forth by the decrease in the interest rate that we saw here on our money market graph. So that takes care of 2011, question 1. Okay, we're on 2011, question 3. It says, Sewell Bank has the following simplified balance sheet. Remember, guys, when we say balance sheets, that's just like the T accounts that we saw in class last week. We have our assets that comes first because A is the first letter in the alphabet. We have liabilities that come second. And this balance sheet, this T account, is a basic accounting concept, right? And remember, one of the basic rules of accounting is that assets must balance out with liabilities. Just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Part A says, based on Sewell Bank's balance sheet, calculate the required reserve ratio. So to do this, we need to direct our attention to 2 values. The demand deposits, how much money has been deposited into this bank, and the required reserves of $2,000. So I hope you guys can clearly see. Make sure you format this properly. That 2,000 with respect to 10,000 is a 20% required reserve ratio. 20%. It then goes on to say, suppose that the Federal Reserve purchases $5,000 worth of bonds from Sewell Bank. What will be the change in the dollar value of each of the following immediately after each purchase, or after the purchase? Okay, so we're on part B, section 1, and it says excess reserves. Now remember, guys, when the Fed buys bonds from banks, it's not like when you or I deposit money into the bank. Okay, if you or I were to deposit money into a bank, a portion of that would be kept as required reserves, and then another portion that would be kept as excess reserves. But in this scenario, since the Fed is buying an asset that the bank already owns, the bank can take all that money and lend out every dime. So excess reserves will increase by $5,000. That brings us to part 2. Demand deposits, right? We talked about how this scenario is not like you or I depositing money into the bank. So these $5,000, none of them are going to go into the category of demand deposits because none of these dollars are liabilities, right? They were earned when this bank sold an asset it already owned. So the change in the dollar value, guys, in demand deposits, there'll be no change, right? Immediately after this purchase, there'll be no change. Okay. Now, again, over time, as banks lend this money out and as the money multiplier takes its course, right, over time, there will be changes, but the immediate change is going to be nothing to demand deposits. And that brings us to part C. Calculate the maximum amount that the money supply can change as a result of the $5,000 purchase of bonds by the Federal Reserve. So we're looking at the money supply. We have a $5,000 purchase of bonds. And I just want to remind you, right, all of these $5,000 can be lent out by the bank. So please keep that in mind. And if we want to see what the maximum change to the money supply is, the first thing we need to do is calculate the money multiplier. So let's remind ourselves how to do that. Remember, whenever you're finding any multiplier in this class, I told you the basic idea that you need to take the inverse of saving behavior, right? And hopefully you guys can recall that the saving behavior of banks is the reserve requirement, because that's how much of your deposits they're required to save as cash in the vault, okay? So here, guys, we would have 1 over 20% or 0.20. And I know that without a calculator, dividing by a decimal can be intimidating. That's why I recommend converting those decimals to fractions. So we'll have 1 over 1/5. The inverse of 1/5, guys, is going to be 5, and that is our money multiplier. So we take that money multiplier, and we're going to multiply it by all 5,000 of these dollars, because this bank will be able to lend out every dime of that 5,000. So 5 times $5,000 gives us a $25,000 maximum change to the money supply. So it could increase by a maximum of $25,000, right? And a couple of key assumptions that need to hold true in order for this to happen, right? Number one, people would have to deposit all of their money into banks to give banks the most amount of money to lend, and banks would have to lend out all of their excess reserves in order for that maximum change to occur. So please keep that in mind. D, when the Federal Reserve buys bonds, what will happen to the price of bonds in the open market? And then they want us to explain. So I know that this is aggravating, guys, and as a teacher it aggravates me, but this is the one thing I want you guys to memorize from this unit. I want you to memorize that bond prices and interest rates have an inverse relationship. So you need to be able to realize that when the Fed buys bonds, that's expansionary policy, right? And expansionary policy means they're trying to stimulate economic activity, and that would lead to a decrease in interest rates. So since there'll be a decrease in the interest rate from this expansionary policy, that's going to lead to an increase in the price of bonds. And don't forget, guys, they want us to explain, there'll be an increase in the price of bonds because of the increase in interest rates. And that brings us to part E. Suppose that instead of the purchase of bonds by the Federal Reserve, an individual like you or I were to deposit $5,000 cash into your checking account. What is the immediate effect of this cash deposit on the M1? Well, again, guys, it's just like the briefcase. Think of the M1 measure of the money supply as being a briefcase with 2 pockets in it. One pocket has cash, and the other pocket has checkable deposits. Initially, this $5,000 started as cash, but when we take that and deposit into our checking accounts, it's going to move to the other pockets in our M1 measure of the money supply, right? It's going to move to be a checkable deposit. So hopefully you guys can see that the M1 measure of the money supply will not change. Okay, and that takes care of 2011.